It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You could find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Do a live show every Friday night at Spreaker.com. That's totally free to join. There's a chat room. Get an email notification when I put up new content. I play repeats over there every single day. And if you go there and search for this name, Christine L. Kramer. Kramer with a K. You'll see the previous interviews I've done with my friend Christine Kramer. She's been a longtime friend of mine, a friend of Victoria's and stuff like that, like a mentor to Victoria. We have a lot of great debt of gratitude to Christine Kramer. And she's always got the inside information, okay? And today we're going to be talking about, because she was working for the RFK Jr. campaign just recently. So we're going to be getting some information about that. Christine L. Kramer, are you there?
I am here. It's so nice to talk to you again.
It sure is, man. I love you, Christine. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us.
Thank you.
But remind for the audience who aren't a couple of old yentas like you and me, can you remind the audience who is Christine L. Kramer?
Oh, wow. So I was very active in politics in Nevada. I've had the privilege of working on 8 different presidential campaigns. And in 2016 was my first appearance on the Opperman Report because I was the neutral public official that did not allow the Clinton campaign to stuff the ballot box at the 2016 convention and deny Bernie Sanders his win in Nevada.
Right.
And from
real quick. Look up that show, man. We burst in live on the air. That's when I met Christine Kramer. She was having a sit-in because they were trying to steal the ballot. She was part of the ballot credential committee, and they did a proactive sabotage on her the night before to sneak in all these guys with no credentials to come in and vote at the caucus. And Christine and her friends sat down in the middle of the street. They were about to in the middle of the convention there. They were about to get arrested, and we burst in live with a live broadcast. They passed the phone around. Do you remember that?
Good times.
Yeah. But I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead. Tell them the rest.
But that also speaks to, it's like I know these workings of how the party works, how political campaigns work, and most importantly, I've always stuck to my integrity of doing things in a fair, reasoned manner. The person who often my role in a campaign is a form of project management and keeping track of everything. And on a campaign, the calendars alone of knowing on a presidential campaign what's happening in the Democratic Party has 57 contests. And then if you switch to independent, then there's 50 different states to keep track of. So that's the type of role that I do in campaigns. But I've also done everything in politics I've thrown entire political conventions for the Democratic Party in states and all of the steps that it takes to manage those pieces. So this year I considered myself fortunate that I was recognized by the original manager of the RFK Jr. campaign, Dennis Kucinich, that I have talent in this area, and I was one of his first hires on the Kennedy campaign. And then once the Kennedy campaign was done with me, I was done with them, which we'll get into a little while later. I was able to go on and be the ballot access director for Dean Phillips.
Gotcha. So, but we're here to talk about the RFK Jr. campaign, right? Okay.
Yes.
Where do you want to start with that?
Oh,
how'd you get the job?
I got the job through friends of friends. When I originally talked about the job, I didn't know that it was Kennedy. I just knew that there was someone that Dennis Kucinich was working with who was running for president, and I had thought that perhaps maybe it was Dennis Kucinich. Mm. And so I threw my hat in there. Here's my background, my credentials. And then I came back. I had been traveling the world that year. I came back to the United States and went immediately from New York to Boston. I was there for Mr. Kennedy's launch and then interviewed with other people in the periphery because they didn't know exactly where they wanted to put me. And then Dennis had decided that I would be responsible for ballot access and delegates because in the time that I was with this campaign, he was still focused on that he wanted to run as a Democrat. And I believe that he was sincere about that he wanted to run in the Democratic Party primary, but no one had fully explained to him. And a lot of my job was coming up with the documentation of explaining to him the complexities of you may be able to get on the ballot fairly easy in many states, but there are also states where you need to do a petition drive, or it's up to the sole discretion of the state party chair or the Secretary of State of a particular state if they're even going to hold a primary. And then that doesn't even get into the complexity of you're asking people to serve as delegates for you. And much of his support base, you have to look at voters and go, how much are you asking them to lift? And so for Kennedy to win the Democratic Party nomination, he would have to ask his supporters first to register as a Democrat by a particular deadline in order to be eligible to vote in the primary, then vote in a primary, then go to the internal party meetings. People don't realize that you become a delegate at the national convention. You're going, depending on your state, to between 2 and 4 additional meetings, going to usually a big convention in your state. And then once you make it through and you're a national delegate, it's going to cost you between $5,000 and $7,000 to go to that national convention. And so there's a process called shepherding of making sure people who want to be your delegate, that you're keeping them engaged and encouraged. And the Kennedy campaign, by the time he made his decision September 22nd to move to being an independent and then had his announcement, I believe it was October 6th in Philadelphia, the campaign was just not organized to a point to be able to acquire delegates, and then we saw what happened to Marianne Williamson and to Dean Phillips, that there was really no path for an outside candidate, even if you had the last name Kennedy, to win the Democratic Party nomination.
Right. Let me just slow you down for a second, because even if you have a huge name, you're a popular guy, who was that guy, the Navy SEAL? He was the wrestler. You know, I'm talking about the...
Oh, Jesse Ventura.
I was going to say Hulk Hogan, but Jesse Ventura. Okay. Even if you got a big name, you got a big following, you got to have your name on the ballot. And the big shots, the guys in power, the oligarchs, they want to do everything they can to keep a guy who's out of the club off the ballot.
Yeah, and they'd even, particularly in the state of Tennessee, the Tennessee legislature changed the rules to deny the Secretary of State of Tennessee to recognize who are widely recognized candidates and put them directly on the ballot.
If people had any idea how our elections are really run.
Yeah, and it's a money game, because the petition gathering process is very, very lucrative. And paying for a petition to get on the ballot in the Democratic primary is going to cost a candidate between $100,000 and $300,000, depending on the state and the very narrow and specific complex rules for the Democratic Party to get on a state ballot. Then when you get to when a candidate wants to run as an independent, you have to have in mind that there is a deadline date. Then along with that deadline date, sometimes there is a filing window where a state will only accept petitions for anywhere between 5 and 10 days, and you need to be within those days. And then we'll have an additional requirement of that signatures not be stale dated. So there's a principle of I can't sign a contract with you, and then the contract we don't act on this contract, and then you pull it up 2 years later. So the same thing goes with a petition. You can't sign a petition a year out from its due date and then have that organization turn the petition in. So they're invested in having very short windows of time. And then the state of Texas has this odd requirement that you need to get signatures to get on the ballot as an independent, but they cannot be from voters that voted in any of the primaries that happened on March 5th.
And so you need people like Christine Kramer who knows these little. She reads all this stuff. Look at her; she's reading off the top of her head. She knows this stuff. And
it's off of my head, but you have to get just deeply immersed in it. It's when I'm doing this work, there's a spreadsheet of all of the states, and then there's a link through, and then pages and pages. And it's not just enough to link to a spot, that you're going to have people within the organization and the public and the press wanting to know what your strategy is on something that you have to meticulously screenshot and then have cross references to it because you can't get it wrong. And my frustration in the Kennedy campaign is that Mr. Kennedy himself was speaking to this Trent Poole guy, and the guy would just say things that were completely whack, that had no basis with reality, that he was doing the hardcore salesman pitch type of thing. And I would be, from my point of experience, saying, look, it's better to wait a little longer, project plan it, project manage it, than go ahead and pay a vendor because he's hot to trot, he wants to do it. I also had offended this vendor because I knew internally that we were examining if the Kennedy candidacy would be more successful as a Democrat or as an independent. And I can't tell this vendor that's calling me up and screaming, and his behavior toward me was so offensive that God bless Dennis Kucinich. He told that man, you don't have the right to speak to my staff that way, and you can speak to me, but you don't have the right to speak to my staff that way.
Now, if you need a little background on this, is a Wall Street Journal article called Inside RFK Jr.'s Chaotic White House Bid. Aides describe a cult-like environment, and they're talking about Kristen Kramer. Aides describe a cult-like environment. They're talking about my guest, okay? Environment in which dysfunction reigns and top aides focus on elevating their own profiles. And one more thing for the Opperman Report audience out there. Keep in mind, remember Reverend Ed Pinkney that had the recall petition? He was trying to recall a mayor in Michigan, and they actually arrested this guy and threw him in prison, convicted him and threw him in prison because 4 signatures had the dates manipulated in some kind of way. He was ultimately released and exonerated, and the conviction was overturned. But that's how serious this kind of stuff is. And it was a big lawsuit, too, to keep Jill Stein off the ballot in Nevada. Hillary Clinton did a job on her. So these things got to be done just right. Otherwise, there's someone on the other side with a lot of money that's going to sabotage and pull the rug out from under you.
Yeah, and petition drives themselves are herding cats, and you need to have motivated people, but you also need to have someone. It's not a person's permanent job to go out and collect signatures. And they have to have a personality where they are okay. They're assertive enough to ask people for their signatures. Usually you try to find people when they're not doing anything else and they don't mind, signing a piece of paper for you. It's a lot of going to transit, like people waiting for the bus in the morning type of thing.
Waiting online at motor vehicle, outside of motor vehicle in the morning.
Yeah. Or if it's allowable in your state, it's very successful up in Seattle that we would go gather petitions on, not particularly for Mr. Kennedy's campaign, but for other campaigns when people are waiting outside for a ball game. Or you go to high school sporting events. So you need some local operators to know where there are going to be people who are registered voters out there. But even then, your success rate on the signatures, if it's 50%, you're having a really good day. And
because once again, the name has to be legible, the address has to be correct, the phone number has to be correct, it has to be verified later on. There's a million things.
Yeah, and then some states will have these onerous requirements where the page has room for 25 signatures, and each one of those pages needs to be notarized. And some states, I really enjoyed doing petition gathering this cycle in Rhode Island because at the end of every day you were allowed to go to the clerk's office, turn in your pages, find out how many you had verified, so you only ended up having to collect as many as needed. But then another state like Virginia, you overcollect by 200 or 300% just because you don't know, unless you have someone working in a back room verifying all of those names, signatures, and addresses. And some operators will do their own internal verification, and other operators are more like throw the spaghetti on the wall and see how much of it sticks.
So then, was Trent Poole? Back to Trent Poole, who's mentioned in this Wall Street Journal article. What was his role at the RFK campaign?
He was trying to become the campaign vendor for petition gathering services. And when he first approached the campaign, he was saying wild things like he was going to gather signatures for us in New York State, and he was going to find names of people that were close to celebrity names to run as delegates so that Kennedy could get more votes. And that was something that you absolutely do not need to do in the Democratic Party. But he was pitching this as a way that, you know, if you're just gathering enough signatures for the candidate to get on the ballot, that's one amount you're able to bill. This guy was trying to build a campaign to run petitions for each individual delegate that would be running into that race. Okay. I later on that same year successfully got Dean Phillips on the ballot in New York State, and we only did a petition for Dean Phillips, and if he had acquired delegates in New York, that would have been resolved at the convention. That was kind of a later on problem to have. But Trent, when he was selling himself as a Democratic Party expert, and he had been the petition gatherer for Tulsi Gabbard in 2020. And there was a gentleman who had made a whole series of videos about how awful it was working with this man back in 2020. And I'm bringing this to the campaign going, what's wrong with this guy that as former super volunteer of a presidential campaign puts out a series of videos about this guy? And yeah, sometimes people get, grudges against each other working on a campaign, but where there's smoke, often there's fire.
But let me just back up to this thing you mentioned about celebrities. You're saying like he would go out and seek out a delegate named Mel Gibson so that people would think it was the celebrity Mel Gibson who was the delegate?
That was the scheme that he was telling us that he could bring to the table and offer to us, and that he could find delegates for us. But he would find delegates that had celebrity names. Real
celebrities or just similar names?
Just similar names.
This is the craziest thing I've ever heard. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm sitting there going, why would a campaign pay for this? But I'm sitting in a room with other people who have never worked in the Democratic delegates process. So if you've never been exposed to this, that sounds like a brilliant idea.
I've never worked there. It doesn't sound so brilliant to me. And then I guess we can put costumes on them, too, disguises to make them look like the celebrities. Dress them up to look like Marilyn Manson, right? Oh, my goodness.
And essentially these states that I wish that state governments would just do, like the state of South Carolina, it does right by its citizens they know that anybody's going to get on the ballot if they pay enough of these signature gathering operating firms to put them on the ballot. So the state of South Carolina, they just put a flat fee of $25,000, and then you can get on the ballot. These other states, the state of North Carolina requests 10,000 signatures to get on the Democratic Party ballot, or you get the state party chair to put you directly on the ballot, or there was another subcommittee of government officials that could determine if someone was a public candidate. And in 2024, they didn't recognize anybody else. So the Kennedy campaign, by moving to independent, they were able to hold on to it and have a bit of certainty that it wasn't up to the decisions of state party chairs or appointed committee members that serve in government or secretaries of state, whether or not they got on the ballot.
Because that avenue, they wouldn't have a chance.
It really seemed more and more like they wouldn't have a chance. And the public also doesn't understand that when it comes to delegates in the Democratic Party, in some states, people are supposed to start applying to become delegates 2 and 3 months before the actual voting takes place. And then you'll have your primary election day, and then you'll have the first meeting, which in Nevada and the West is a county convention, and some are called like district caucuses in the East. So you need to really be engaged and have a high level of communication with voters even before they voted, and cultivate that level of supporters. And a lot of my job was, and the Democratic Party, adding another layer of complexity to it, is you need to work within their diversity, equity, and inclusion plan that they want to see of a delegation so many people under the age of 35, which is what they consider their youth vote, so many people who identify as African American, so many people who identify as Hispanic, Latino, and so many people who identify as LGBTQ. So the data becomes even more complex because on the campaign side, you need to have people fill out essentially an application saying which of these categories they fall into and explain to them the time commitment that's required of it. And we'd be doing these forms because each state is unique. And I kept running into barriers of that Kennedy's first system admin responsible for all of his Google Workspace was a 19-year-old who had just graduated high school the year before. He'd never had a job, much less been associated with a campaign, so didn't understand the complexities of this data. And then I would have to spend hours explaining this is how this works, and then it would never get fixed.
Now, once again, what was that role the 19 was filling? The 19-year-old?
He was the original system admin over the Google Workspace. He's in charge of all the email accounts, all of the documents, all the subdomains by state. I was the fill-in state director for the state of Nevada, and I couldn't get access to anything. When you're talking about concerns about security, I hate to refer to him as, really, he's a kid.
A young man.
He's trying to tell me that I need to share passwords with another person, that I'm the state director and they don't trust me enough to look at the information for Nevada. And that kind of held me back. And so then I'm thinking, like, a campaign that people who are uncomfortable with having any type of power, they don't share it and they don't know how to delegate properly. So the field operation for Kennedy at the time I left it, they had no ability to delegate just the most basic pieces of data. I couldn't collect data and then merge it in with from Google Workspace into their nation builder. And I think something I've appeared on the Opperman report about before was I was one of the first people working within Nation Builder, this voter software, and the Democratic Party tried to shut me down. And it was absolutely insane that the original founders of Nation Builder, they were people who had worked in the Democratic Party, but they weren't going to take pennies on the dollar to give up their software to the Democratic Party's controlled van software. So I actually had certification in the software, but because I'm a 50-year-old woman, they did not wish to engage me on that. Like, it was always that some people could state like wild things off the cuff where I'm sitting there, anyone can look at my LinkedIn profile. I hold 50 different tech certifications, but I'm not considered as qualified as a 19-year-old.
Wasn't there an issue, too, where you wanted people to use their home phone numbers and their personal email addresses and their personal cell phone numbers?
So in Google Workspace, you can have separate phone numbers. Because I've been in this long enough, I don't like people knowing my personal phone number. And I go to them and I'm like, look, I need to set up a set of 10 different Google Voice phone numbers. There's going to need to be a separate one for each state. And he doesn't understand the basics because he doesn't understand what it's like to have a job where 300 people are calling you in one day, and when you need to separate it out and make it available for volunteers to be returning those phone calls. I'm sitting in a meeting and it's like, I don't have a problem with anybody in the world having my personal phone number. And it's like, you don't know what the job entails.
Now, also, and too, isn't it a big issue, too, that you guard these emails and these phone numbers because they're worth a lot of money to build up these lists? And was there any issues with the lists being available?
No, the lists weren't available, but they also didn't know what to do with the data. And there were times that early in the campaign, I would ask questions like, are you doing this with the data? How are you backing this up? How are you setting up the subdomains? And they were like, well, that's none of your business. And then just as I was leaving the campaign, I found out that their database had blown up and that they had to rebuild their databases at the end of October. And so that meant that everything that he data collected from April to October was bogus.
Gotcha.
I mean, and if you don't know what you're doing in a database, like I asked him, so I have a sandbox, and a sandbox is basically where if you want to do, you keep a master copy of your database, and then if you want to change things or see how a set of data merges, then you play with it in your sandbox. He didn't know what the term sandbox meant.
Gotcha. Now, you sent me a screenshot because now we're getting into some serious stuff. There's some serious allegations here, right? And you sent me a screenshot. Can we discuss that without mentioning the person's name?
I'm trying to remember the nature of the screenshot.
The screenshot was a text about armed guards.
Oh, yes. I don't know any more about it other than that there was a volunteer in California who is speaking to another media outlet who says that she had upset Trent Poole so badly that she had to hire armed guards. And that is part of why, thinking about that, knowing the way that Trent Poole acted toward me, just in that I set professional boundaries that that Mr. Kucinich also enforced, that he was not to scream at me, that we set the professional boundary, that we had time in the process of hiring people to gather signatures. And there's hundreds of vendors that do this across the country. I had an RFP process. In case anyone doesn't know, it's called Request for Proposal, and that is where you ask multiple vendors the same set of questions so you can compare apples to apples, because otherwise these guys talk so fast they'll run you over. And all of the other vendors respectfully completed my RFP, answered my questions. They were able to provide references of people who they'd provide these services for. And I also had two very important questions on there. One was, have you ever been accused of not paying people who work for you? And are there public complaints on file about this? Because I will go find them. And the second question was, have you ever been accused of harassing anyone? Because what we're doing in these is sometimes with these petition gathering firms, we're sending them these very wide-eyed, optimistic, naive volunteers who you send them to the wrong person, they could become victims.
And political campaigns are notorious for that kind of thing. You see, all the time you hear this kind of crazy stuff.
Yeah, and when I started on my first political campaign, I did a little bit of stuff when I was 14, as much as my mother would let me. But I was full-time on my first presidential campaign at 18 years old for Jerry Brown, knocking doors in Iowa. And I saw a lot of things, and I was harassed, awful harassment as a young woman. And I also received the type of harassment as a young woman that I know I had parents back home that would say, if these men don't treat you right, you can go home. And I was the type of young woman who fortunately was able to look men in the eye and say, don't do that to me. But I also faced the type of environment of, well, you know, that's just how that guy is, and he acts that way towards all of the women. And I made myself a promise when I got involved in politics, I was always going to stand up for the young women coming up behind me, and always on the campaigns I manage. And I feel very privileged, like your daughter has worked for me at different times, that I have created environments where nothing as far as harassment is going to happen. And so I'm sitting in a position to actively prevent harassment of individuals. It was not just about Trent Poole and the rumors about him. It was any vendor that's coming into a campaign that I'm helping manage. I want to know their background, and I want to know if there are these accusations, then maybe they're not our prime vendor. They might be like a second or third tier backup vendor. But I also know some very amazing vendors in this country that they should be elevated because they do such a good job of looking out for their staff. And this isn't a consistent job. This is something where you want to hire an operator that has the same people that come back and work with them every cycle.
So then was this a concern with Mr. Poole that he had allegations in the past?
Yes, this was a concern. He didn't want to complete the RFP. He complained about it. I had one small typo, which was in part because it was like every single day, 5 a.m., a new text message of like this. Man, it was like his grammar was so terrible. I would have to read his text message that he sent Mr. Kennedy, who then sent to Mr. Kucinich, and then my morning would have to be spent going, here's actual screenshots of the law or the Democratic Party rules, why this man is wrong. And then I had to defend the aspect of having an RFP and comparing, and Mr. Poole didn't have the best estimate. And then I even went back to the other management of the campaign, and I said, if you're concerned that I'm not being fair to this man, how about my assistant go and strip the names of the companies off of all of these bids? And then you guys make a decision, like
Brilliant.
here's a scoring sheet, and do it that way. Didn't want to do it that way. Like they flipped out. And it was also at a point in time where we knew it was most likely he was going to switch from Democrat to Republican. But what concerned me ethically was this guy who is an outside vendor is demanding access to see what his competitors bid because he's promising that he could drop it by 20%. And in the real world of business, these guys are just looking to get their foot in the door, and then they're going to say the fickle finger of fate hit them when they can't meet their goals, and whoops, they need more money. And then I've watched vendors who are the lowest bid, just in my experience of contracting for numerous things, they suddenly became a higher bid than the highest bidder who actually has a cohesive budget and plan and experience doing it.
Well, in the process of competitive bidding, if this was like a government contract, that would be a crime. To say, show me the other bids. But now, what about the RFK campaign? Did they have a process to vet out the people or potential vendors? Was there an internal security department that was doing background checks on these people?
So I was considered an outside vendor. That when campaigns come back and say, oh, well, so-and-so, they're an outside vendor. Well, most of the time on a campaign, you are an outside vendor because they prefer not to pay you W-2. So then pretty much everyone's a contractor. Then eventually the Kennedy campaign later on had W-2 employees, but I was a contractor too. So the whole process. So in my process working for the Kennedy campaign, I had to submit myself to a background check with Gavin DeBecker investigation. I was never told what they found in the background check. There were times that I was like, why is it that I am cut from these different discussions? Why is it? I mean, is there something in my background that concerns them? Then there were times like that I never knew, like, if they were using it against me, and I had a right to know because it was connected to my quasi-employment to know what the result of that investigation was. I never knew what those were. And then I don't know if they ever made Trent Poole, because Trent Poole, all of the time he's causing this chaos while I'm in the Kennedy campaign. Kennedy campaign has not written him a check. He wasn't paid until after I left. He was just consistently calling Mr. Kennedy, saying these things like numbers of signatures and that I should have had him out there 2 weeks ago, calling me lazy, calling me incompetent. And I was never, Mr. Kennedy never called me personally asking me about my work product. Mr. Kucinich was the buffer in between those, and I provided numerous things. I did weekly reports of the status of ballot access and the calendar and delegates. It was called the Mission Control Report every week to Mr. Kucinich. And then in a proper campaign, the candidate, because you need to preserve their energy and you need to really focus their time on fundraising, there's something called the briefing cycle. So everyone who's a director on a campaign will do their reports, and then those go to the campaign manager, and then the campaign manager briefs the candidate. And then from that forms what the candidate is doing for the next week and the next month ahead. When you have an outside vendor making wild claims, and I at first gladly and graciously answered all of those out of the sky weird complaints and weird accusations that I wasn't getting my job done, thinking that Mr. Kennedy reasonably would look at it and go, this guy's been wrong 3 times in a row, 5 times in a row. Maybe I'll stop taking his calls. He never did.
Well, let me see if I understand this. Then Trent Poole he's an unpaid consultant advisor in some capacity, and somehow he's in a position to be reviewing your work.
Yeah. And it was like, I'm doing the homework for someone, and in this wild world of politics, by 2028, he will end up competing with me for the same job. Right. I mean, he was gunning for my job, and he was able to throw wild accusations and things into the campaign, take up my time answering them and sending them back. And then people would then tell him, you're wrong because of this, this, and this. And he would never be like, oh, I guess I was mistaken. No, it would turn into, he would just pivot to another state. And in the Democratic Party process, there's 57 states. He wasn't reading the delegate selection plans. He wasn't reading these state websites. He was just calling up like, I think I want to say that you ought to be on the ground in this state collecting 100,000 signatures, which would be completely wild. And no one ever pulled him back except for Dennis Kucinich would be like, look, we're going to have this RFP process. We will just judge apples to apples. We will have the names off of them, and the management team will make a decision who our vendor is going to be based on the best proposal. And the other proposals were well written, showed a lot of business acumen, and Trent's was, how dare you, I've been volunteering and giving, as he called him, Bobby advice every day.
Well, then let me ask you this. What was the budget for these vendors? Are you putting out a request for proposals? What's the budget out there that you're expecting, ballpark?
I was expecting a budget of anywhere between $12 to $16 per signature. And some of these bid proposals, and when the bid proposal comes back higher, then you have a conversation with the vendor going, well, what are some factors, like maybe I have missed something about overhead. And there were some states where it came back extra high, and then I found out that, oh, they need street vendor permits, or
Gotcha.
They need a level of insurance. And then when you're comparing the two, and then you see we have one vendor that says, our bid is this high because we're required to have insurance, and then another vendor says, well, we're just going to ignore the insurance, then you know how that is. I wasn't even able to get that far in the process because in the middle of it, that was when Kennedy decided to run as an independent. And then once he announced, once the buzz was in that he was going to run as an independent, and this was supposed to be a super, super secret thing, he let it out where there were other people talking about it online, that they had talked to Kennedy himself, and he told people that he was going to run as an independent before staff knew. And before me, the person who'd been doing all of the research, who's still putting in 50 hours a week, doing everything to set him up to run as a
Democrat.
To run as a Democrat. It's like, to know that there were days, weeks of your life wasted after a decision was made.
I have a question, though. Now, if someone in a position, this Trent Poole, where he's bidding for a contract, but in the meantime, he's working for free, when does that become your labor for the campaign become a donation to the campaign? And what's the legalities with that?
Well, you're allowed. Well, I have to first of all say I'm not an attorney, therefore I can't apply or interpret the law.
Right.
But in the world of campaign finance, people can donate their time.
Okay.
So if you're a lawyer, you can go over to any campaign and say, "Hey, I'm going to volunteer. Take it as it is." And it's not until you're actually producing, like representing the candidate in court type of thing, that if this Trent Poole had actually gone to a state and collected a bunch of signatures and collected no fee for those signatures because the signatures have a market value,
right,
then that could have been an in-kind contribution. But his goal was, hire me, get me paid to collect signatures as soon as possible, and inserting himself into what should have been a reasoned process, looking at the calendar, looking at budgets. On a campaign, we don't even know, when a campaign first starts, we don't know how much money a candidate is going to have. Are they going to have a $2 million budget, or are they going to have a $200 million budget? And so you have to form it for any way that it's going to end up. And where I've been in the campaign world before, when I'm sitting in Kennedy's campaign and they're like, well, we're not doing this and we're not making a decision about that, and nothing, I wouldn't hear back on my work. They're going, well, we're drinking from a fire hose. I'm sitting here going, I need to set up these databases and get decisions made, because you're about to have a tsunami if you're successful.
Christine, we have about 10 minutes left, less than 10 minutes. So what else is really important you want the audience to know about the RFK campaign?
I'm also very concerned about their hiring of Nick Brana, who my concern is, I'm not going to speak to that there are specific harassment allegations out there about him, but that this campaign, when I did all of this work for them, there was never a complaint that my information was inaccurate. There was never a complaint that my information did not arrive on time. That I worked hard. Mr. Kucinich, before he left that campaign, complimented me on how well I understand this process better than most Americans and most people who work in this field. That this campaign showed so little respect for me that they hired Nick Brana to be my boss behind my back. They never mentioned what makes him more qualified than me. And this is a man who failed at Movement for a People's Party. He fundraised and made it appear like he was going to start a whole new party for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders wants nothing to do with this man. Then he failed up and he was running Cornel West's political campaign.
Really?
And Cornel West this cycle had a lot of false starts, couldn't get it together. When I last saw Cornel West about a month ago, he was this, I can't believe that Nick Brana, we fired him from my campaign, and then they thought he could be your boss on Kennedy's campaign. And what's interesting is that this is how small a world presidential politics is that in the process, when Cornel West fired Nick Brana, he interviewed me to run his campaign and eventually went to Peter Dow at that point. And then I had gone on to the Dean Phillips campaign. So there's a limited pool of those of us who think we know how to do this.
Yeah.
And the way the Kennedy campaign absolutely disrespected me that I go all the way to Philadelphia for this announcement. Trent Poole is standing there like 3 feet away from me everywhere I go. He's not even on the payroll yet. Certain people are denying that he's ever going to be in the campaign, but he's there at an employee event and just hanging around. And he later on sent a condescending email that I wouldn't sit and speak to him about the plan. And it's like, well, he's an external vendor. I shouldn't be talking about the campaign's internal plans with him until I have a written document that says otherwise. And then we're having a staff dinner in Pennsylvania the night after Kennedy announced that he was independent. I go to that with my assistant, and someone comes up and introduces Nick Brana to me, who I know who exactly that man is because I've been in the same room with him before. And he's there to help with ballot access. And I'm like, I'm the director of ballot access, and I do an RFP process. And I did tell him to his face, I don't hire people who abuse others. That is how firm I am in my knowledge from other sisters who work in politics that this man is abusive.
Then what is it about Kennedy and his relationship with Poole? Like, they have some kind of friendship or a past relationship?
I don't know if they have a past relationship, but he talks to Poole all the time. And then from what I've learned from other people who were on the campaign after me who have since left is that Poole and Brana were really good friends and they got along great. So I had no chance. My work product didn't get to stand on its own, and I felt like I got somehow not under the fold, and it's particularly insulting to me as someone who has worked on my skill and my craft and always having the receipts for anything that I work on in a campaign, that these two guys get to fail up. And I've seen emails and messages where they called me lazy and stupid. And I know that's not me, but I also know if they're going to do that to me, what were they doing to their subordinate staff?
What about other issues on the RFK campaign of money allocation and then budgeting and salaries and stuff? It's like a squandering.
The salaries have no connection with reality. That I was actually like very flattered when I first came on that campaign. I made a bid that was a reasonable amount of money. And then Dennis Kucinich called me and said, with what other people are asking for on this campaign, and I know you're worth it, you need to rewrite your letter and give yourself $2,000 more a month.
Wow.
But it's also systemic to so the political cycles, when we know who the nominees are going to be, and there's a crunch on it because we knew that it was always going to be Biden and Trump, people ask for a lot more money because everyone knows they're not going to work after those campaigns.
Right.
So when everyone knew that it was going to be Obama in 2012, people who worked on third-party campaigns or the small number that challenged Obama, they asked for more money. So that is something that's systemic in there. But I was working with people that had absolutely zero political experience, zero operations experience, didn't understand just the basic acumen of operating in a campaign. That I still refer to him as Mr. Kennedy because that is a sign of respect. Just as when I work for someone who's if they're an elected, I always call them by their elected title, congressman, something along that. And you have to do that for your own safety and protection as well, because when you're working with the public, and I tried to explain this to them, especially to protect young women. If young women are in public referring to their candidate as Bobby, 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 then people who could do them harm, who are somewhat deranged, think that they might have a way of getting them in with the candidate. So where it's appropriate for, in this campaign, the campaign manager Amaryllis because she is his daughter-in-law, to perhaps refer to him as Bobby, it puts us in danger to refer to our candidates by their first name and imply we have a type of personal familiarity if we're working in the field.
Yeah, and that's open to abuse. You know what I mean? People,
Yeah, and that also goes back to my personal phone number was not going to be out there for the public because everyone's just a couple clicks away from being discovered.
Yeah. Christine Kramer, anything you want to plug? I forgot to get your plugs. You got a website or anything? Twitter, Facebook you want to promote?
I don't at the moment. I had written a book called Campaign Land, which was funny stories about working on campaigns from Dukakis all the way to Amy Villela. And now I've gone back to a re-edit because my life this past year, working on Kennedy and then Dean, had some pretty funny moments. So I hope to get that re-edited and out and shopped around again. Oh,
I'd love to see that. Yeah. Plus, a reality TV show with Christine L. Kramer would probably be, probably be up there too, you know? Oh, my goodness. Listen, thank you so much. Christine L. Kramer, a political insider. You're not going to hear stuff like this anywhere else. This is a real political insider. It's telling you what goes on behind the scenes. And keep an eye out for this Wall Street Journal article here. I was telling you about a minute ago, if I could find it again real quick.
Yeah, there's the Wall Street Journal article, and then there's the CNN article, RFK Jr. ballot access consultant charged with assault, and that is about Trent Poole, that he has been charged with assault in Washington and in New York City.
Well, there you go, man. Inside RFK Jr.'s chaotic White House bid, aides describe a cult-like environment in which dysfunction reigns and top aides focus on elevating their own politics. Christine L. Kramer, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Good night.